So, good evening. I am welcoming you to Chapter 13 for Bio 211 at Norwalk Community College. And in Chapter 13, we're going to cover the spinal cord and the spinal nerves. And we're going to start off with sort of reminding you that the spinal cord and the spinal nerves are covered by meninges. And those meninges are made up of three different parts. And remember, they're assembled in a specific way. We'll go over that in a couple of minutes. But the three parts are, of course, dura mater, arachnoid matter, and pia mater. And think about what I had you guys do inside a lab. For those people who are not taking this class and just listening to it, remember pia mater essentially is adhered to the gray matter of the brain, but also the white matter of the spinal cord. And in doing so, what Mother Nature creates is this barrier that keeps materials away from nervous system tissue. The central nervous system is separated from the rest of the body. It is surrounded by cerebral spinal fluid, and that cerebral spinal fluid travels through epidural space, subdural space, and subarachnoid space. That subarachnoid space is made because the dura and the arachnoid matter are adhered together. So passing between the arachnoid and the pia mater is where you'll find cerebral spinal fluid. Taking a look at this cartoon here, you can see here's the dura mater, the arachnoid matter, and the denticulate ligaments that are holding all of this in place, because the pia mater in red, deep to the arachnoid matter, is cerebral spinal fluid. Pia mater surrounds this entire structure. Remember a minute ago I said that the actual pia mater is adhered to this. And what I want you to see, of course, is that the spinal cord has the mechanisms to allow for neurons to send information into the central nervous system through the posterior aspect here, and send motor information out through the anterior aspect here. So we'll go over how Mother Nature built one of these spinal cords for us, and then we'll think about what it's functioning as. You can see inside the cartoon here that you actually have the posterior median sulcus on the back, and you actually have the anterior median fissure in the front here. When we actually look at the spinal cord itself, this is the posterior aspect of the spinal cord with all the bone removed. You should appreciate that. And what I mean by that is you should pay attention to the fact that it's not there. And there are a lot of other things that are not visible on this preparation of the spinal cord. But what you can see here is that if that's the medulla, and that's the first bone of the cervical spinal cord, vertebra, okay, you can start counting the nerves. So C1, C2, C3, C4, C5, C6, C7, C8. These make up the cervical nerves. Thoracic nerves, lumbar nerves, sacral nerves, and some coccygeal nerves down here. What I want to make sure you pay attention to is Mother Nature is attached, of course, the spinal cord to the medulla. But down here at this conus medullaris, the tapering of the spinal cord itself, you have a piece of pia mater that extends all the way down here to the filum terminale that's actually anchoring it at the bottom of this figure here. Inside your body, that's what's actually going on. But at the same time, she's also sending out not a very robust cauda equina in this model, but essentially a horse's tail that travels down the remainder of the distance till we get to these sacral prominences down here. Additionally, what Mother Nature's doing is she's creating a plexus of nerves that are going to respond to the responsibilities of all of the both sensory and motor regions of the body. We're going to build a dermatome from all of these nerves that are sending motor information out and collecting sensory information in. And some of the major ways to do this, of course, is to use the cervical plexus. Most important for our class, at least, is going to be the phrenic nerve, 3, 4, 5, keep yourself alive. The brachial plexus, these are for the appendages, for the upper trunk. Notice there is no thoracic plexus. You'll see why that's very important inside Chapter 15 for the sympathetic autonomic nervous system. But there is a lumbar plexus, as well as a sacral plexus. And in some textbooks you might find actually a coccygeal plexus down here. What does it actually look like? So when we actually break this figure apart, you'll see in a moment when I pull this thing up, you can actually see here's that posterior median sulcus. So there's a transverse section through the thoracic spinal cord, and there's a reason why they picked that part of the spinal cord. We'll get to that in a minute. But it's always really important to know where back and front is. So dorsal, ventral, posterior, anterior. And you know that because there's a dorsal root ganglia here, also called posterior root ganglia. And here's the anterior rootlets that are going to form the anterior nerve, which is going to be motor output. And we know that because not only is it color-coded inside our text, but this is just basic information you have to understand. Most sensory impulses travel, I'm going to say all for the purpose of this lecture, travel in via the posterior root ganglia, where their cell bodies, sorry about that, I hate when that happens, their cell bodies are located inside that dorsal root ganglia. And in this cartoon, they're going to synapse with something, and that's going to be an interneuron. And you remember from chapter 12, that means it's an unmyelinated C-type fiber. It's going to be responsible for processing that information and figuring out what should happen to it next. This red dot is the cell body of a motor neuron that will exit through the anterior portion. And I pointed this out in class, but this is the reason why they actually use the thoracic spinal column, is they're foreshadowing, or they're preluding the significance of that lateral gray horn in the autonomic nervous system, and specifically the sympathetic motor outputs that we'll have to discuss inside chapter 15. There's a lot of other stuff going on here. They've denuded this. This is the pia mater right here, but then there would be cerebral spinal fluid all the way around, traveling all through these spaces and through that central canal. This is all white matter, which means these are the axons of neurons that are both ascending towards the brain and descending away from the brain. And how they do this, you'll see when we actually take a look at some pathways in a few minutes. So how many nerves do we have? Well, I told you a moment ago, if you believe everything I've told you so far, you actually have 31 pair of mixed nerves. And this means that you understand that you have both sensory and motor. OR. Responsibilities traveling on C1 through C8, T1 through T12, L1 through L5, and S1 through S5, as well as that coccygeal nerve. What's important for you to understand is Mother Nature needs to keep all of that information precise. So as the axons of those neurons travel in these spinal nerves, they make up these spinal nerves, she separates them by using connective tissue coverings, one of which is going to be epineurium, perineurium, and then the endoneurium. And she's going to bundle all these together. That's what fascicle means. And you'll see what's actually happening here right now. When you're looking at, this is the individual axon of one neuron, and it is surrounded by connective tissue that is called endoneurium. We bundle all of that in perineurium, okay, which is connective tissue, to make a fascicle, and then you bundle all of that in epineurium. So you have epineurium surrounding perineurium surrounding endoneurium, and all you're really doing when you're traveling through one of those spinal nerves is you have the axons of sensory or motor nerves. And you can't tell which is which here. You can't look in this picture and go, that's a sensory axon and that's a motor axon. What I want you to appreciate is in every single one of those 31 pair of nerves, any one of them could be sensory and motor. And these are all the blood vessels to make sure you keep all of those cells alive. We don't really talk about inside this class how Mother Nature keeps them alive, just that they are kept alive. Okay. They branch. As you come away from that one central hub, the spinal cord, you actually have to have rami, and that's what we're talking about. You have a dorsal ramus, which is responsible for sending those axons of neurons as a nerve towards the dorsal portion of the body. Likewise, the anterior or ventral ramus does exactly the same thing. You do not have anterior rami, okay, such that you do not see T1 through T11 to form plexuses. So everything but thoracic 1 through thoracic 11 will form a plexus inside the body. So what are those plexuses? You have this one here, C1, C2, C3, C4, C5. You'll see some of these branch off to multiple plexuses, but the one we want to pay attention to here, of course, is the phrenic nerve, because without this, we do not breathe. It's that simple. Whoops, that didn't come out the way I had hoped it would, but we'll figure it out later. Okay, sorry about that. What I want to make sure you see here is as we move from, say, the cervical plexus down to the brachial plexus, we're paying attention to the responsibilities, the sensory and motor responsibilities of these appendages, in this case your arm, and in this case your right arm, even more precisely. And to do this, we send things down through roots trunks, divisions, cords to the actual nerve itself. So more complex pathways until you actually get to the location where the nerve actually has to function. And I've showed this to you inside class. Here's the colored pattern that I want you to pay attention to. So here's your root, here's your trunk. You have an anterior and posterior division. What's moving anteriorly is moving posteriorly. And then how do you actually get to the cords and the branch itself? Okay. As we move, notice we skipped over the lumbar part. We're going to move now down to the thoracic part. We're now going to move down to the lumbar part. And there's L1 through L4. And these are for the anterior lateral abdominal wall, as well as external genitalia and part of the lower limbs. Without worrying about what the femoral and obturator nerves are, these are, of course, the distinct lower portions of the body. If you think about, say, everything from your hips down. Okay, here's your hip bone right here, traveling all the way down. When we get to the sacral part, we're actually feeding L4 and L5 as well as S1 through S4. These are your buttocks, your perineum, and the lower limbs. And of course, this is where you're going to get your sciatic nerve, but that's about all I really want you to know about these things. It's more important to know that you actually have a sacral plexus, a lumbar plexus, no thoracic plexus. You have a brachial and cervical plexus that supports that sensory and motor movement of materials into the body. And what I mean by that is sensory movement in, motor information out. So we can make a map of that. You can literally map all of the sensory input into the central nervous system via one pair of spinal nerves. Okay, and you can travel C2 all the way through S1 here. Okay, you notice there's one cranial nerve on this. We come back to that when we actually get to the cranial nerves inside chapter 14. But right now you can pretty much see that if this is a dermatome, all the sensory pieces are traveling in. There's going to have to be a myotome or a patterning of nerves that innervate musculature inside the body such that you can control it. So how does Mother Nature do this? She does this by creating a series of tracts, and these are color-coded inside your textbook. They're not color-coded inside your body, but what you can see is, generally speaking, sensory input can be found in the posterior columns, the gracial fasciculus and the cuneate fasciculus here, as well as the posterior spinal cerebellar tract and the anterior spinocellular tract, as well as the spinal thalamic. Okay? Because you see it on one side here, it means you also have a mirror image of it on the opposite side. Likewise, everything that's red here for motor output is going to be on the opposite side here. Okay? Well, if you understand this, and you remember the earlier figure where we had, say, sensory input coming in, see if I can do this without mucking it up. Sensory input traveling in, yay, boom. I'm going to travel in. Remember, there was an interneuron here. It's not what I wanted to do. I don't like when the computer does this on its own. And then you have motor output traveling out, right? If you remember all of that, okay, and it makes sense to you, okay, then you're going to see what we're going to do next. Because you need to be able to survive multiple types of environments, right? I want you to understand that what Mother Nature can do is she can make a reflex, and that reflex is a response to that is automatic, sudden, involuntary, and what it's going to do is it's going to integrate the sensory input such that you have a motor output at the same, well, not literally at the same time, but pretty damn close. And you're going to make that reflex arc that I have now hopefully impressed upon you is really important to understand. Okay? You have to have a sensory receptor located someplace that's a part of a sensory neuron, which is going to travel through that dorsal root ganglia into an integrating center inside the spinal cord itself. And that integrating center, of course, is an interneuron. So once the interneuron's been activated, you remember we're going to activate a motor neuron, and that motor neuron will cause an effector to become activated, and you can see that here. It's the same figure you have inside your textbook, where, in this case, attack gets into your hand. You're going to pull your hand away quickly, but how do you pull your hand away quickly? That information is sent into the gray matter of the spinal cord, activating that specific interneuron, and then it's going to activate the motor neuron, which is then going to cause the muscle to actually contract and pull your hand away. Well, we went through this reflex inside lab. I'm not going to go through it again right here, but, just follow the stimulus. You guys don't use the sharp end of the patellar hammer here, but use the flat end, and you're going to pull on sensory muscle spindle fibers, and you're going to cause a signal to not only travel to activate agonistic muscles, but notice I made a big deal out of the fact you activated an inhibitory interneuron. Okay, so you can relax the antagonistic muscles. Well, let's put it together, the whole story on the end here, where what you're doing in this is you stepped on a tack, you pushed your toe into a tack, right? Immediately that sensory input traveled up and said, oh my God, that hurt. Look at the number of interneurons that were activated, and now pay attention to the types. This is polysynaptic, contra, and ipsilateral activation of descending and ascending neurons so that you can, one, have a motor output to pull back the foot from the tack you stepped on or kicked or whatever it was. But because you changed your center of gravity, you also had to have a complementary response such that you can now establish the crossed extensor reflex to ensure that you contracted the musculature of the opposite leg to make sure you didn't hurt yourself. And that's a pretty good place to stop for chapter 13. Remember, this is, do you understand how a spinal cord is built? Do you understand how reflexes are functioning? Have a good night.